Search her pockets, the woman said with a smile that never reached her eyes. If something goes missing in a mansion like this, everyone knows where to look first. The words drifted through the grand ballroom with the weight of quiet judgment, and within seconds the soft music seemed to fade beneath a wave of whispers. Every crystal chandelier continued to glow with warm golden light. Every polished marble floor reflected the elegance of the evening, yet the air itself suddenly felt colder. Naomi Brooks stood motionless beside a silver serving cart, her white housekeeping gloves wrapped tightly around the polished handle. She had only worked at the Harrington estate for 3 days, but she already understood one unspoken rule. In a house filled with wealth, the people wearing uniforms were expected to disappear until someone needed someone to blame. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the guests surrounding her. Men in tailored tuxedos exchanged skeptical glances, while women wearing glittering designer gowns lowered their champagne glasses just enough to watch the scene unfold without pretending they weren't fascinated. No one asked what had actually happened. No one wondered whether the accusation made sense. They simply looked at the young black maid standing alone beneath the towering staircase and allowed silence to become its own verdict. Naomi swallowed carefully, forcing herself to breathe through the growing pressure in her chest. Her late grandmother had taught her something years ago after another unfair accusation at a grocery store. People will tell you who they are long before they tell you the truth, she had said. Naomi remembered those words now as clearly as if her grandmother were standing beside her beneath the sparkling lights. She kept both hands where everyone could see them. Calm, respectful, steady. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Carter, the estate manager, hurried toward the gathering crowd with measured steps. Her tailored navy suit looked as crisp as always, and the silver tablet tucked beneath her arm reflected the chandelier light. "Everyone, please remain calm," she said politely. "We'll sort this out." But her voice carried little authority against the excitement spreading through the guests. Rumors moved faster than facts inside expensive rooms. A diamond bracelet had reportedly disappeared only moments earlier, and somehow every suspicious glance landed on the newest employee. Naomi could almost hear the assumptions forming before anyone dared to speak them aloud. She had polished the windows overlooking the West Garden that afternoon. She had arranged flowers in the dining hall an hour earlier. She had quietly refilled water glasses throughout the reception. Yet none of those honest moments mattered anymore. All anyone seemed to remember was that she cleaned for a living. At the far end of the ballroom, standing alone beside a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking acres of perfectly trimmed gardens, Richard Harrington watched everything without saying a single word. His expression revealed nothing. One hand rested inside the pocket of his charcoal jacket, while the other loosely held a crystal glass untouched since the evening began. Unlike the guests, he wasn't watching the missing bracelet. He was watching people. Every glance, every whisper, every person who chose convenience over compassion. Naomi noticed him only for a brief second before lowering her eyes again. She couldn't read his face, and somehow that frightened her more than the accusations themselves. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the Virginia hills as rain began tapping softly against the enormous windows. Inside, the music finally stopped altogether. The ballroom became so still that the faint ticking of an antique grandfather clock echoed through the mansion like a heartbeat counting down towards something none of them could yet understand. Naomi kept her shoulders straight even as the silence settled around her like invisible weight. She had learned long ago that dignity was often the only thing life allowed her to keep. The polished marble beneath her shoes reflected the glow of the chandeliers above, making it seem as though she were standing on a sheet of still water. Around her, conversations resumed in hushed voices, but none of them included her. Every glance lingered just long enough to remind her that being unseen had always been easier than being misunderstood. 3 days earlier, before sunrise painted the Virginia sky with pale shades of blue, Naomi had stepped off the county bus carrying everything she owned inside one worn canvas bag. The Harrington estate had looked almost unreal from the front gate, stretching across dozens of carefully landscaped acres where ancient oak trees lined the long driveway, and fountains sparkled beneath the early morning light. She remembered tightening her grip on the bag as she whispered a quiet promise to herself. This job was not about pride. It was about keeping another promise, the one she had made to her mother inside a small hospital room only 2 weeks before. Her mother had smiled through exhaustion and gently squeezed Naomi's hand. "Do not let hard days change your kind heart," she had whispered. Those words had followed Naomi into every hallway she cleaned, every window she polished, and every room where she quietly worked while pretending not to hear conversations that reminded her she did not belong. She arrived before most of the household awakened each morning, tying her apron with careful hands before sunlight reached the eastern gardens. She noticed details other people ignored. The scent of fresh cedar drifting through the library after the windows were opened. The soft creaking sound of the grand staircase just before 7 o'clock. The way morning light turned the crystal chandeliers into thousands of tiny stars floating above the ballroom floor. She believed every place deserved care, even when the people inside it overlooked the hands providing that care. Some of the kitchen staff had welcomed her with gentle smiles and quiet encouragement. Others barely acknowledged her presence, too busy or too cautious to become friends with someone new. Evelyn Carter had remained professional from the beginning, expecting precision, punctuality, and absolute discretion. Naomi respected that. She never complained when assignments changed or when unexpected guests doubled the workload. She simply worked harder, believing that consistency spoke louder than explanations. During her lunch breaks, she usually sat alone, on a small wooden bench overlooking the estate greenhouse. Instead of scrolling through her phone, she often called the dialysis center to check on her mother's afternoon appointments or read another chapter from a weathered leadership book she carried in her bag. She had always believed wisdom could grow anywhere, even during 15 quiet minutes beneath the shade of an old maple tree. None of the guests inside the ballroom knew any of this. They did not know she had graduated near the top of her community college class before putting her education on hold. They did not know she had turned down opportunities in another state because family came before ambition. To them, she was simply the newest maid standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. As another low rumble of thunder rolled beyond the rain-covered windows, Naomi lifted her chin ever so slightly. She could not control what strangers believed. She could only control the person she chose to remain. Richard Harrington did not step forward when the whispers began. He did not interrupt the accusations, nor did he rush to defend anyone. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, standing beside the towering window as rain traced slow silver lines across the glass behind him. His calm unsettled people far more than anger ever could. Guests who had known him for years exchanged uncertain glances because this was not the reaction they expected from the owner of one of the most respected estates in Virginia. Richard had built Harrington Holdings from a regional construction company into one of the largest real estate firms on the East Coast, earning a reputation for discipline, patience, and impossible standards. Employees often said he could walk through one of his properties for 5 minutes and notice details everyone else had ignored for weeks. He remembered names. He remembered conversations. More importantly, he remembered character. That was why the annual charity gala was never simply another elegant evening. Every gathering inside the Harrington estate served another purpose, one almost no guest ever recognized. Richard believed people revealed their true values only when they believed someone beneath them could not answer back. Wealth, influence, and expensive clothing often disguised the truth, but pressure had a way of stripping away every carefully polished mask. Tonight, he had spent more time observing conversations than participating in them. He noticed which executives thanked the servers who refilled their glasses and which ones accepted service without a glance. He noticed who smiled at the musicians and who treated them like furniture. He noticed who greeted the housekeeping staff with quiet respect and who walked past them as though they were part of the wallpaper. Every small decision mattered to him because every small decision revealed something larger. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Carter watched Richard carefully. She had worked beside him for nearly 18 years and understood his silence better than anyone. More than once, she considered walking over to ask whether security should begin searching the ballroom or escort the guests into another room until the missing bracelet was found. Each time she caught Richard's steady expression, she decided against it. He was waiting. For what? She could not yet tell. Near the center of the room, Victoria Langford adjusted the diamond necklace resting against her emerald evening gown before speaking just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. These situations are always unfortunate, she sighed, her tone polished with artificial sympathy. But valuable things do not simply disappear. Several people nodded almost automatically. Others avoided looking directly at Naomi, unwilling to challenge the assumption that had quietly spread through the room. Richard shifted his gaze from one face to another. He was not studying the maid anymore. He was studying everyone else. Every uncomfortable smile. Every convenient silence. Every person who accepted suspicion as proof simply because it confirmed an expectation they already carried. Outside, the rain intensified, washing across the enormous windows while distant lightning illuminated the rolling hills beyond the estate for a brief moment before darkness returned. Inside, the grandfather clock marked another minute with a deep mechanical chime that echoed through the ballroom. Richard finally placed his untouched crystal glass onto a nearby table with deliberate care. The soft sound of glass meeting polished wood was almost inaudible, yet dozens of conversations stopped at once. Without raising his voice or changing his expression, he slowly stepped away from the window and began walking toward the center of the ballroom. Every polished shoe striking the marble floor sounded measured, calm, and unmistakably intentional. No one spoke. No one moved. They all sensed that whatever happened next would reveal far more than the location of a missing bracelet. Richard stopped a few feet from Naomi and allowed the silence to settle over the ballroom. His eyes moved slowly across the gathered guests before resting on Evelyn Carter. "No one searches anyone," he said evenly. His calm voice carried through the room more effectively than a shout ever could. Several guests exchanged puzzled looks while Victoria Langford folded her arms with visible impatience. "Surely you are not suggesting we simply ignore a missing diamond bracelet," she replied with a polite smile that barely concealed her irritation. Richard turned toward her without changing his expression. "I am suggesting that assumptions are not evidence." The room grew quiet again. Naomi remained perfectly still, her hands resting gently at her sides. She knew every pair of eyes was still fixed on her, but she refused to let humiliation dictate her posture. Evelyn stepped forward carefully. "Sir, perhaps we should at least verify where everyone has been during the last 15 minutes. Richard gave a slight nod. "That would be reasonable." Before anyone could respond, Naomi spoke for the first time since the accusation had begun. Her voice was soft, respectful, and remarkably steady. "Mr. Harrington, may I say something?" A few guests looked almost surprised that she had spoken at all. Richard met her eyes. "Go ahead." Naomi took a slow breath. "About 20 minutes ago, I was replacing fresh flowers near the west hallway. I noticed one of the terrace doors was left open because of the rain. I closed it before returning to the ballroom." Victoria released a quiet laugh. "And how exactly does that help us?" Naomi did not react to the mockery. "As I walked back, I saw someone bend beside the antique console table near the music room. I could not see the person's face because they turned away when they heard my footsteps. I assumed they had dropped something, so I continued working." The ballroom became noticeably still again. Richard listened without interrupting. "Why did you not mention this sooner?" he asked. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "No one asked what I saw. They only asked where I had been." Those words seemed to linger in the air. Even guests who had remained comfortably silent moments earlier shifted uneasily. Richard noticed every reaction. Some people looked thoughtful. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Victoria smiled again, although the confidence behind it appeared thinner now. "That could describe almost anyone here," she said. "It changes nothing." Richard glanced toward the hallway Naomi had mentioned. Beyond the ballroom entrance, warm wall sconces illuminated a long corridor lined with family portraits and polished walnut tables decorated with fresh orchids. Everything appeared perfectly undisturbed. Yet something about Naomi's answer had changed the rhythm of the evening. She had not defended herself. She had simply offered an observation without blaming anyone else. That difference mattered. Richard slowly folded his hands behind his back. "Evelyn," he said, "please ask the security office to bring me the recording from the west hallway and the music room. I would like to review the footage before anyone reaches another conclusion." A faint ripple of surprise spread across the room. Victoria's composed expression faltered for the first time that evening. "Security cameras?" she asked carefully. Richard looked toward her. "Every public hallway inside this estate is monitored for the safety of our guests and staff." Outside, The rain continued falling steadily across the gardens, while distant lightning briefly illuminated the towering oak trees beyond the windows. Inside, no one seemed interested in the weather anymore. Every conversation had disappeared. Every guest now watched Evelyn as she quietly spoke into her radio before disappearing down the corridor. Richard remained where he was, his gaze never leaving the room. It no longer felt like a search for a missing bracelet. It felt like the beginning of something much larger. The ballroom seemed to shrink as every passing second stretched into uneasy silence. No one reached for another glass of champagne. No one admired the orchestra quietly waiting in the corner. Every eye drifted toward the hallway where Evelyn had disappeared, then back to Naomi, as though the truth itself had become something people feared as much as they desired. Richard remained perfectly still, his posture relaxed. Yet his presence commanded the room more completely than any raised voice ever could. Naomi could feel the weight of dozens of strangers measuring her without speaking. It was a feeling she knew too well. Years of quiet endurance had taught her that prejudice rarely arrived shouting. More often, it arrived wearing expensive clothes and polite smiles. Victoria Langford broke the silence with a gentle laugh that sounded almost rehearsed. "While we wait for the cameras," she said, glancing around the room. "Perhaps common sense should guide us. Valuable jewelry rarely disappears without someone taking advantage of an opportunity." Several guests nodded almost instinctively. One elderly businessman quietly added, "It is unfortunate, but these situations usually end exactly as expected." Naomi heard every word, yet she kept her breathing slow and steady. She remembered her mother's voice reminding her that another person's assumptions were never proof of her worth. Richard turned his attention toward the businessman. "Expected by whom?" he asked calmly. The older man hesitated before answering. "Well, statistics, experience, people simply know." Richard's expression remained unreadable. "Interesting," he replied, "because I have spent 30 years discovering that people often mistake familiarity for truth." The room fell silent once more. Victoria crossed her arms more tightly. "Surely you are not questioning everyone else's judgment because of one employee you barely know." Richard looked toward Naomi for only a brief moment before returning his attention to the guests. "On the contrary," he answered, "I am questioning judgment that appears before evidence." His words lingered beneath the crystal chandeliers like the final note of a symphony. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, not from shame, but from gratitude that someone had finally chosen fairness over convenience. Then another voice interrupted from the back of the ballroom. "If she has nothing to hide, why not simply search her belongings?" The suggestion spread through the room almost immediately. A few guests murmured in agreement, while others remained uncomfortably quiet. Naomi slowly reached toward the small canvas bag she had left beside the serving station earlier that evening. She lifted it with both hands and looked directly at Richard. "If it helps bring peace to everyone here," she said softly, "you may look inside." The gesture surprised nearly everyone. There was no anger in her voice, no resentment, only quiet dignity. Richard did not even glance at the bag. "No," he answered immediately. "No honest person should have to surrender their dignity simply because others surrendered their judgment." Those words landed with unexpected force. Several members of the household staff, standing near the entrance, exchanged emotional glances. Even some guests who had silently accepted the accusations now appeared uncertain. Naomi carefully lowered the bag again. She had expected another test. She had not expected someone to protect her dignity before protecting his reputation. Just then, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Evelyn returned carrying a secure tablet in both hands, her expression composed but noticeably more serious than before. She stopped beside Richard and quietly said, "The recordings are ready." Richard accepted the tablet without looking down at the screen immediately. Instead, he slowly raised his eyes toward every guest gathered in the ballroom. Outside, the rain finally began to ease, but inside the mansion the atmosphere had never felt heavier. Everyone sensed that within the next few moments, something far more valuable than a diamond bracelet was about to be uncovered. Richard held the tablet in both hands, but made no attempt to wake the screen. The ballroom waited in complete silence, yet he seemed more interested in the people standing before him than the evidence resting inches from his fingertips. Outside, the rain softened into a gentle rhythm against the tall windows, and for the first time that evening, the storm no longer sounded threatening. It sounded patient. Warm light spilled across the polished marble floor, reflecting every motionless figure like a painting suspended in time. Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, her canvas bag resting quietly beside her feet. She realized that her heartbeat had finally begun to slow. Whatever happened next was no longer something she could control, and strangely, accepting that gave her peace. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment and remembered the little church her mother used to visit every Sunday morning. She remembered sunlight filtering through colored glass windows, the scent of polished wood, and her mother's gentle reminder that truth often walked more slowly than judgment, but it always arrived. When Naomi opened her eyes again, she noticed something she had not seen before. Several members of the household staff were no longer standing apart from her. The chef had quietly stepped closer. One of the gardeners who had come inside because of the rain now stood near the entrance with his cap held respectfully against his chest. Even one of the young servers offered Naomi the smallest encouraging smile before lowering his eyes again. No words were exchanged, yet their silent presence reminded her that kindness often revealed itself in moments when speaking carried a cost. Richard slowly looked around the ballroom once more. He noticed every subtle change. The confidence that had filled several faces earlier had begun to fade. Some guests folded their arms less tightly. Others stared at the floor as though replaying their own words inside their minds. Evelyn stood beside Richard without interrupting the silence. During nearly 2 decades of working together, she had learned that he never hurried important moments. Facts settled more deeply when people had time to confront themselves before confronting evidence. The grandfather clock echoed another measured chime through the estate. No one reached for a drink. No one checked a telephone. The orchestra remained perfectly still, their instruments resting quietly beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers. It felt less like a charity gala now and more like a quiet courtroom where every conscience had been called to testify. Naomi looked toward one of the enormous windows overlooking the rain-covered gardens. Tiny drops slid slowly across the glass, catching reflections of light before disappearing into the darkness below. She realized those drops reminded her of difficult seasons in life. Each one eventually found its way downward, but every one reflected light before it disappeared. She smiled almost imperceptibly, not because the evening had become easier, but because she refused to allow bitterness to become part of her story. Richard finally touched the tablet, waking the screen with a single movement of his thumb. The soft glow illuminated his composed face for only a moment before he lowered the brightness. He looked at Evelyn, then at Naomi, and finally across the room filled with guests whose certainty had quietly transformed into uneasy anticipation. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt the stillness. The silence itself had become heavier than any accusation made that evening. Richard drew one calm breath before selecting the first security recording. As the loading symbol slowly turned across the screen, every eye in the ballroom followed it. And in that quiet moment, the truth seemed closer than ever before, waiting not to embarrass someone, but to reveal the character each person had already chosen to display. Richard turned the tablet, so the screen faced the ballroom, and with one gentle tap, the first security recording appeared. The image showed the west hallway exactly 23 minutes earlier, its polished walnut table decorated with white orchids, and a silver lamp glowing beneath soft amber light. Guests leaned forward without realizing they had done so. The room became so quiet that the faint hum of the ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Naomi watched the screen without expectation. She had already accepted whatever truth the cameras would reveal because she knew she had nothing to fear. The recording showed her walking into the hallway carrying a small arrangement of fresh flowers. She carefully adjusted the vase, noticed the terrace door standing slightly open as rain drifted inside, and crossed the hallway to pull it shut. She paused only long enough to wipe a few drops of water from the marble floor before quietly continuing toward the ballroom. Every movement reflected the same quiet attention she had shown since arriving at the estate. Richard allowed the recording to continue. A few seconds after Naomi disappeared from view, another figure entered the hallway. Victoria Langford. She glanced over both shoulders before stopping beside the antique console table. Without realizing the camera captured every movement, she reached toward her bracelet, unclasped it, and lowered it behind a decorative porcelain planter resting beneath the table. She remained there only for a moment before calmly fastening her sleeve and returning toward the ballroom with composed confidence. A sharp breath escaped someone near the orchestra. Another guest quietly whispered, "That cannot be." Richard did not stop the recording. Instead, he selected a second camera angle from the music room entrance. The footage showed the same sequence from another perspective. Naomi walking past without hesitation. Victoria entering moments later. The bracelet disappearing behind the planter. There was no uncertainty, no missing angle, no room for interpretation. The truth unfolded with complete clarity. Victoria's face lost every trace of confidence. She stared at the screen as though hoping it might somehow change. "There must be some mistake," she said quietly. "I only—" Her words faded before she finished the sentence. Richard gently locked the tablet and lowered it to his side. He did not sound angry when he spoke. Somehow that made his words even more powerful. "There was no mistake," he said. "Only a decision." No one interrupted him. The bracelet was never the greatest loss in this room. Tonight, trust was. He slowly looked across the guests gathered beneath the chandeliers. Not one person asked for evidence before deciding who should carry the blame. A young woman was judged because of her position, her uniform, and assumptions that required no proof. Several guests lowered their eyes. Even those who had never spoken during the accusations suddenly appeared uncomfortable beneath the weight of their own silence. Richard turned toward Naomi. "When you offered your bag to be searched," he said, "you were willing to surrender your privacy for the comfort of strangers. Yet you never accused anyone in return, even after being accused yourself." Naomi answered softly, "My mother taught me that truth does not need anger to stand." Richard nodded almost imperceptibly. "She raised someone extraordinary." The words settled gently over the ballroom. Members of the household staff exchanged quiet smiles while several guests looked at Naomi differently for the first time that evening. Not as a maid, not as a suspect, simply as a person whose dignity had remained untouched despite every attempt to take it away. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Moonlight slipped through the clearing clouds and spilled across the towering windows, replacing the storm with a calm brightness that reflected across the marble floor. Inside the estate, the silence no longer belonged to suspicion. It belonged to recognition. No one moved for several long seconds. The ballroom that had been filled with whispered assumptions now held only the quiet sound of steady breathing and the distant drip of rainwater falling from the stone terraces outside. Victoria Langford looked down at the polished marble beneath her feet, her shoulders no longer carrying the confidence that had defined her only moments before. The diamond bracelet that had nearly destroyed an innocent woman's reputation now rested inside Evelyn Carter's gloved hand after being retrieved from behind the porcelain planter exactly where the security recording had shown. Its sparkle no longer represented luxury. It had become a reminder of how easily appearances could deceive. Richard accepted the bracelet from Evelyn, but made no effort to return it immediately. Instead, he turned toward Victoria with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. "Would you like to explain why you chose to place it there?" he asked quietly. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I wanted to prove a point," she admitted, her voice trembling with regret rather than fear. "I believe people should be more careful about who they hire. I thought if everyone suspected the newest maid, they would understand my concerns." A wave of disbelief swept across the room. Several guests looked away, unable to hide their disappointment. Others seemed equally disturbed that they had accepted the accusation so quickly without questioning it themselves. Richard slowly nodded. "You succeeded in proving something," he replied. "Just not what you intended." His eyes moved across the ballroom once more. Tonight revealed how quickly intelligent people abandon fairness when prejudice offers them an easier answer. His words settled heavily over every guest. No one attempted to defend themselves. Excuses suddenly felt too small to matter. Victoria turned toward Naomi, her eyes glistening beneath the chandelier light. She took several careful steps forward before stopping a respectful distance away. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I allowed my assumptions to become accusations, and I invited others to do the same. I am deeply sorry." Naomi studied her quietly. She saw embarrassment, regret, and perhaps the first genuine humility that had appeared on Victoria's face all evening. She remembered every whisper, every suspicious glance, every painful moment of standing alone beneath the staircase. She could have answered with resentment. She could have reminded everyone how easily they had believed the worst about her. Instead, she offered a gentle smile that surprised even herself. "Thank you for telling the truth," she answered. "I hope tomorrow you will see someone else before you see their uniform." The simplicity of her response seemed to touch the room more deeply than any speech could have. Richard looked at Naomi with unmistakable respect. "Character," he said quietly, "is measured most clearly when someone has every reason to be bitter and chooses kindness instead." Several members of the household staff wiped away discreet tears while guests who had remained silent during the accusations now appeared visibly humbled. Richard finally handed the bracelet back to Victoria. "This belongs to you," he said. "I trust you will remember what it cost." She accepted it with trembling hands, but did not put it back on. Instead, she closed her fingers around it as though it had become something far heavier than diamonds and precious metal. Richard then turned toward Naomi once more. "Beginning tomorrow morning," he said, "I would like you to work directly with Evelyn Carter as her administrative assistant. I do not promote people because they are perfect. I promote people because they have demonstrated integrity when no one expected it." Naomi's eyes widened with quiet surprise. She placed one hand gently over her heart before answering. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. I will do everything I can to deserve your trust." Warm moonlight streamed through the towering windows, replacing every shadow the storm had left behind, and for the first time that evening, the mansion no longer felt divided by status. It felt united by a truth that every person present would remember long after the music finally began again. The following Monday morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight that spilled gently across the Harrington estate, washing away every trace of the storm that had lingered only days before. Dew shimmered across the perfectly trimmed lawns. Birds drifted between towering oak branches, and the marble entrance reflected the clear blue Virginia sky. Naomi Brooks stepped through the front doors carrying the same worn canvas bag she had brought on her first day. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Her shoes were still polished with care. Her uniform remained perfectly pressed. Her smile was still quiet and sincere. Yet everything around her felt different. As she entered the grand hallway, members of the household staff greeted her one by one with genuine warmth. The young server who had once been too nervous to speak now smiled confidently and wished her a good morning. The chef handed her a fresh cup of coffee before returning to the kitchen. One of the gardeners tipped his hat with quiet respect as he carried flowers toward the conservatory. These were small gestures, almost invisible to anyone passing by, yet Naomi understood that true respect often arrived quietly. It did not announce itself. It simply appeared in everyday kindness. Upstairs, Evelyn Carter welcomed Naomi into her new office overlooking the East Gardens. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with carefully organized records, blueprints, and family photographs that captured decades of life inside the estate. Evelyn smiled as she placed a leather notebook on the polished walnut desk. "This belonged to the first estate manager who ever worked here," she said. "Mr. Harrington asked me to give it to someone who understood that leadership begins with serving others." Naomi accepted the notebook with both hands, holding it carefully as though it were far more valuable than its worn leather cover suggested. She thanked Evelyn quietly before opening the first page, where a single handwritten sentence appeared in faded ink. "Character is what remains when no one is watching." Naomi read the words twice before gently closing the notebook. Downstairs, Richard Harrington stood beside the same floor-to-ceiling window where he had watched the gala unfold only a few nights earlier. The morning light reflected softly across the glass as he observed the estate coming to life. Evelyn joined him after a few minutes, following his gaze toward Naomi, who was laughing gently with several members of the staff while helping arrange fresh flowers in the entrance hall before beginning her new responsibilities. "You were right about her," Evelyn said quietly. Richard smiled almost imperceptibly. "No," he answered. "She was simply willing to show everyone who she had always been." Outside the front gates, life continued as it always had. Cars passed along the quiet country road. Children waited for school buses. Neighbors walked their dogs beneath the bright autumn sky. Most of them would never know what had happened inside the Harrington estate, and perhaps that was exactly how it should be. Some of the most important victories never appear in newspapers or become headlines. They happen silently inside human hearts when prejudice gives way to understanding and dignity overcomes suspicion. Naomi paused for a moment before beginning her work, looking through the tall windows toward the sunlight stretching across the gardens. She thought about her mother, about the promise she had made in that small hospital room, and about every difficult day that had led her here. She realized that kindness had never made her weak. It had carried her through every misunderstanding without allowing bitterness to take root. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves outside, sending ribbons of golden light dancing across the marble floor. No applause filled the mansion. No dramatic speeches echoed through its halls. Only quiet footsteps, warm morning light, and the peaceful certainty that truth had found its place, leaving behind something far more valuable than justice alone. It had left behind hope.